Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Talking Foreign Affairs series with Adil. My name is Adil Cader, the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Ambassador for Western Australia. This is the first in a series of discussions where I interview key figures in the arena of foreign affairs and diplomacy. Joining us today, I'm honored to be having a very distinguished guest on my first show, the Honourable Gareth Evans. Gareth served as Australian Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996. He's also served as the President of the International Crisis Group and as Chancellor of the ANU. Gareth was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2012 for his eminent service to international relations. Indeed, we are very lucky to have him on the show. Gareth joins us from his office in Melbourne. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to join you, Adil, and
Thank
congratulations on the new initiative.
Thank you very much. So to start off with, Australia is often been referred to as a burgeoning middle power. How would you summarize the current status of Australian foreign policy and our current status in the world?
Well, I've described middle powers as a working definition of those countries which are not big enough or strong enough economically or militarily to actually impose their policy preferences on others, but are nonetheless sufficiently credible in terms of their energy and adaptability and engagement to be able to make some kind of impact on the larger global scene. That was certainly my aspiration as Foreign Minister, to fully realise Australia's status, and there are many different contexts in which we work that out, working on global public goods issues, regional public goods issues, mobilising constituencies in countries and getting some big things done. I think in terms of Australia's current foreign affairs activity, a little bit of that energy and a little bit of that enthusiasm, a little bit of that capability has in fact dwindled away to the extent that we are not as prominent or as active in the wider regional and global scene as we have been at various stages in the past. It tends to be a little bit linked with who's in government, whether it's Labor or the Conservative parties. Labor is traditionally more preoccupied with multilateralism, a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more idealistic, perhaps, in terms of a little bit more optimistic in terms of what might be achievable. And the contrary is the case with the other side of politics. That said, I mean, there is still a pretty high degree of bipartisanship, as there should be in Australia's international relations. But by and large, I don't think we have been punching at the weight that we do have sufficiently often in recent times. And there's lots of issues like climate, obviously, in which we really do need to re-engage and re-establish some credibility, but also in peace and security issues and regional architecture development, broader economic and trade initiatives, the kind that we did with the Uruguay round all those years ago. Not to mention some big arms control disarmament issues. I think the middle powers do have a significant role to play when it comes to energising a new commitment to move towards more successfully the elimination of nuclear weapons, the kind of role we played in the past in relation to chemical weapons. And in fact, we've been a significant voice on the nuclear front in the past. All of those things have tended to go missing a bit from Australian foreign policy, which has disappointed me. But we do retain a very good professional capacity within the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I think it really is just a matter of perspective and energy, as well as having, of course, having an international environment that is welcoming or susceptible to these kinds of activities. And of course, that is an issue at the moment as to what the international environment is really going to be like post-COVID. But I guess we'll come to that in our discussion.
So you raised the point of how maybe we've not been punching our weight in recent times. Do you think Australia as a country generally we have the potential to be a very influential power, not just in the Asia-Pacific region, but in the wider world?
Well, we've shown that in the past. I've already mentioned the Uruguay Round initiative, where Australia really did, for quite a few years, lead the charge in terms of agricultural free trading countries coming together and opening up the global environment in that respect. We played a leading role getting the Chemical Weapons Convention brought to fruition, which is a highly global enterprise. Under the other side of politics, we played a leading role in the United Nations in getting the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty actually brought to fruition after stalemate in the negotiations in Geneva. So on those global issues, as well as, of course, on regional issues like the creation of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, or the creation of the ASEAN Regional Forum for Peace and Security Dialogue, the role that we played obviously in the Cambodian peace settlement, which is well remembered in the region. These are all examples of the kind of energetic middle power diplomacy that I'm talking about. But and I think we have to be conscious that we're never going to be a major player. We'll only ever be a niche player in the global scene, and we need to concentrate and focus our resources and energies accordingly. But we can be an influential player. We have been in the past, and I certainly haven't given up on us being that again in the future. If the international environment becomes a little bit more conducive to sort of things, as it may well do with the Biden administration in the United States, but no doubt we'll come to that.
Sure. So obviously tying in both the previous answers, the COVID pandemic has really had a major impact on diplomacy. Australia's response to the COVID pandemic has been exemplary in our conditions. Some people have said have been the envy of the world. How do you think Australia's response to the COVID pandemic has impacted our standing internationally?
I think it has done us some good, obviously, the effectiveness with which we've been able to take advantage of our island continent status, which clearly is an advantage as compared with most other countries, and really take the hard decisions to work together pretty effectively at both the national and the state level, and the integration of those different jurisdictions, which has clearly been a problem in some other complicated governance countries. No, we have done well. The governments collectively have done well, and that has done some good for our reputation. On one particular COVID issue, I don't think we helped ourselves very much by trying to lead the charge in terms of an international investigation of China. And that was a classic example of something which should have been much better prepared diplomatically and operationally, because it not only was not particularly effective in energising the kind of global coalition we thought we might be able to generate, it was others, really, the Europeans, that took the initiative and delivered that. But it was also very, of course, counterproductive in terms of our relations with China itself. But so that's the one sort of misstep we've made in relation to COVID. But I think in terms of our domestic handling of it, and we've been very tough on international travel and quarantining and all the rest of those things. But I think it's well understood that these were entirely legitimate responses. And yes, you do get a tick internationally when you respond well to these situations, just as the United States is getting a very big cross internationally in terms of its abominable handling by comparison of the issue.
So you were saying in regards to the investigation into China and potentially being counterproductive, how do you think would have been a more effective approach to handling it? Do you think it's in Australia's interest to be calling for an investigation, or are there other ways around it?
Well, of course, there needed to be an investigation, a lessons learned investigation as to the circumstances of the outbreak, how it was originally handled, how communications were handled with the rest of the world. Absolutely legitimate to go down that particular path, but we should have been doing it in cooperation with other countries, in consultation with China itself, rather than really grandstanding in the way that we did, not talking to any other country and just making fairly strident demands of China to open itself up to inspection and so on, which was taken very badly. It was an incredibly sensitive period for China's relations with the rest of the world, and we didn't do ourselves any credit with the way we handled that. I mean, I don't exaggerate that. That by itself is not the reason by any means for the deep hole in which Australia-China bilateral relations is now in, but it certainly contributed to the atmospherics of that. One other dimension that was mishandled, I think, was that it because the call on China, for this investigation, and the call on it to the world to mobilise to impose one on China, came very soon after some very visible consultation with the United States. So it played very directly into that deputy sheriff narrative, which has been something that Australia has really needed to avoid in terms of our relations, not only with China, but most of the rest of the region and the world. We don't do ourselves any good when we're seen to be simply an acolyte of the great imperial United States. We're far better, far more credible, far more effective when we're seen to be acting totally independently. And I don't think that was the case with the COVID inquiry call.
On the note of COVID, Australia is leading the way in regards to the UK-led vaccine. What do you think the soft power diplomatic results of that are going to be? Is Australia stand to benefit from such an initiative?
Well, we've been one of the key players in vaccine research, whether we've been real groundbreakers in the way that the Turkish couple have been, and with and other aspects of it with other researchers in other places have perhaps moved a bit further and a bit faster. But look, Australia has played a very cooperative research role, sharing data with other key researchers around the rest of the world, demonstrating a willingness to move quickly on vaccine production, demonstrating a willingness to work with the rest of the world with the international effective distribution of where the new vaccines are needed most. So in terms of all that, I think we've handled ourselves pretty well, and certainly Australian scientific researchers, biotech researchers are very well regarded internationally, and we certainly haven't gone backwards in terms of international respect in that area as a result of our handling of the virus issue.
Sure. And on the note of working with the rest of the world, multilateralism has come under the microscope in regards to COVID. I know you spoke in defense of multilateralism to a recent UK House of Lords Select Committee. In the context of COVID, how do you think multilateral will be embraced, and this is taking into account criticism of the WHO?
Well, the world can, I think, go in two directions as a result of the COVID crisis and its devastating impact in so many places. In one direction would be a reinforcement of sovereign nationalism, raising defences, raising barriers, getting anxious about international supply chains, getting anxious about openness generally in terms of people movement and everything else. And, that could reinforce some of these tendencies towards, pretty ugly, inward-looking, isolationist, populist government that we have seen in so many countries. From another point of view, a much more optimistic point of view, COVID will be a very big wake-up call as to the absolute necessity for international cooperation on big global public goods issues like pandemics, that no country is an island, no country can go it alone, no country is immune from the implications of these kinds of existential threats. And the only way to do it is through multilateral cooperation, through the WHO in particular in the context of pandemics, but through the whole army of other international organisations that have evolved since the Second World War and have been so much a key part of creating this decent rules-based international order that we in Australia so much want to preserve. So it's a big call as to which way the pendulum will swing on this. I'm an incorrigible optimist, as the title of my recently published memoir makes clear, and I do think that the greater instinct at work in the future will be a recreation of the multilateral instinct rather than the inward-looking instinct. And I think absolutely crucial in this respect is the advent of the Biden administration, which clearly has that multilateral frame of reference. It hasn't abandoned completely, I guess, what will no doubt be some continued bad old American habits of going it alone and unilateralism when it sees its interests as demanding that. But obviously Biden's instincts and those of the people around him are very, very strongly wedded to international cooperation and recreating the effectiveness of the WHO, recreating the energy behind the climate negotiations and recreating an instinct for multilateralism right across the whole sort of peace and security arena. So I think in that context, we can look forward to a general sort of change of atmosphere. Had the Trump administration continued, I think all the indications, were that this was quite disastrous for international cooperative confidence and multilateralism generally. And I think we would have, plunged back into that that area of isolationism that I regard as so damaging. So no, I'm confident that there will be a new burst of energy in this respect. But of course, these institutions are very mixed blessings in terms of the effectiveness of the way they work, and very often they're prisoners of pretty petty politics. And rising above that and getting the best out of the international system will be a challenge for policymakers everywhere in the period ahead. Even if the basic instinct is to make these things work, you've still got to operationally do it.
Yeah. So you were saying about how under a new Biden administration there'll be new global commitment to multilateralism. Obviously, over the past 4 years with the current administration, there's been a lot of pullout in regards to global leadership and multilateral leadership agreements. Do you think within one term it's possible to restore, the Biden administration can restore the US back to where it was in terms of commitment to multilateral leadership agreements, and that to Australia's advantage?
Well, I don't think the world is going to go back to, where it was exactly before. And I certainly don't think it's going to go back to an environment in which the United States sort of leadership with a capital L or preeminence with a capital P are going to be the dominant and visible characteristics of the global scene. I think the reality is that America has lost a fair bit of ground in terms of obviously its soft power, obviously its credibility generally, and certainly in terms of its capacity to set the terms of the game by itself. A lot of, whether we're talking about in East Asia or whether we're talking about in the wider world, certainly a lot of that capacity has diminished. So, the restoration of that dimension of the glorious American past is going to be tricky. The restoration of a greater commitment to multilateralism, which always ran alongside the America leadership storyline, because America, after all, has created most of the multilateral, has been the key driver in creating most of the multilateral institutions of the post-war world. It's been an absolutely critical player in creating that. So there's always been a degree of ambivalence, and the United States has played a fantastically important role in creating the multilateral world that is so critical in all our interests. But at the same time, as periodically walked away from it, and periodically, the sort of culture of American primacy has been in tension with the kind of compromises and strategies of give and take that are involved in genuine multilateralism. But when you sort of balance all those things out, it won't be the same world as we had before. It will be different. America's lost a lot of its credibility. China has obviously been gaining in strength, but not necessarily in terms of credibility, given the way it's been handling itself recently. Many other countries are very, very keen to see multilateral cooperation being restored and these institutions becoming more effective again. So I think that combination of environments and changes in leadership will be conducive. But we're inching our way forward. We're nosing our way forward. No one can make confident judgments about what kind of a world it's going to be over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years and beyond. It's very much a world in transition at the moment.
And you were saying how it was the US who traditionally was leading the multilateral push with the founding of the Bretton Woods Institution. You were saying the US is not going to be as influential as it once was. What do you think there are going to be other countries that will try to step up and lead the multilateral push and try and be the new leader that the US once was? And if so, which countries do you think they would be?
Well, China itself is obviously not going to be satisfied with just being a rule taker. It does want to be a rule maker, and it's already pushing for a greater role in governing boards of key institutions, and it's accepting gradually, bit by bit, greater responsibilities in terms of making financial contributions to these organizations. So how China plays this is really, the number one factor that will determine how all this plays out. And I haven't given up at all on China as a responsible player in the multilateral game. I mean, China's, for all the chest beating and assertiveness and aggression that's been troubling us from Xi Jinping under his leadership, China has, continued to play a very important constructive role in things like UN peacekeeping, on issues like arms control, the nuclear issue that I'm particularly concerned about. I haven't given up at all on China as a key player in, mobilizing efforts towards genuine nuclear risk reduction, for example. Clearly on climate, China is stepping up in a very big way, and I don't think that's just a matter of cynical opportunism. I think there's domestic imperative to get some cleaner air, but they also understand the international responsibilities that are involved. So, China's going to be crucial, but obviously how Europe plays the game internationally, how some of the other key players, the BRICS countries, so-called, how India, play. I mean, India's not an enthusiastic multilateralist, never has been, but it's become a very, very big and important country economically and in other ways. And how it's opted out of participation in the RCEP's, RFCEPS, the Economic Partnership Arrangement, where it had been hoped that India would be a player. And there's always that constant sort of nervousness about the UN and the wider international multilateral scene. So India is going to be a key player, Europe's going to be a key player. Some of the other BRICS countries, I mean, Brazil maybe, if it can get its internal act together. South Africa, the Africans generally, are not wanting to be, marginalised in perpetuity on the global stage, and a lot of African voices are being heard to considerable effect. And by and large, the key African countries, the Nigerians and so on, are keen, multilateralists, and I would expect some commitment and some input from there. The Middle East countries are going to be very problematic, as ever. Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and obviously Syria and its current catastrophic situation. Turkey has abdicated a lot of its traditional commitment to the broader scene. It's been looking inward and behaving in a rather unhappy fashion in a number of ways. So it's problematic as you look around the world, just how much of a commitment there's going to be. But I think on the whole, there's enough energy and enough reason to be confident about the key players' recognition of the need for significant cooperation, significant collaboration on these big existential issues, weapons, pandemics, climate, and on a whole bunch of other issues like terrorism and piracy and trafficking and God knows what else that are incapable of being dealt with individually by countries and that do require that collaboration. So I think the need is there, and I think the instinct is sufficiently there in a sufficient number of key players for us to see a revival. But the jury's still out, and nobody can be totally confident about which way the world is going to go.
Sure. And you spoke about the rise of China and India trying to be a bigger player. Australian foreign policy has been dominated over the US-China question in regards to, in case of a conflict, who we should side with. But over the past few years as well, there's been increased tensions between China and India, various border battles. Do you think we could face a similar dilemma should conflict happen between both China and India and us having to take a side? And given the recent new Quad arrangements, does that complicate things?
Well, the Quad arrangement is not remotely a military alliance of the kind which creates mutual commitments to come to each other's aid. And just as India would be very reluctant to be drawn into some sort of conflict that Australia might stumble into with China, so would Australia, of course, be very reluctant indeed to be drawn into a conflict that could erupt, yes, of course, between India and China, if cooler heads don't prevail on some of these volatile border and other issues. I am reasonably confident that worst case scenarios of that kind can be avoided. I think we give insufficient credence in talking about the possibility of hot war breaking out in various contexts. We give insufficient credence to the kind of learning experience the world has been through since the 20th century, and there's always the possibility of stumbling or sleepwalking or accidentally clambering, falling into violent conflict. But in terms of deliberate aggression to pursue national interests, territorial expansion and so on through conflict, I think the stakes are these days so high, the risks of catastrophe are so high that balancing the risks and the downsides against the possible rewards leads you to such an imbalance in terms of risk reward ratio that I'm generally reasonably confident that these things can be avoided. But of course, one of the things that will avoid it is messaging to countries that might be minded to be a bit over-assertive and to overreach, that they're not necessarily going to have it all their own way. And the real utility of the Quad, with Australia joining up in a very visible way with India and Japan as well as the United States, is that it does send a message to China that there's a degree of unhappiness with the kind of assertiveness that China has been demonstrating in South China Sea and elsewhere. And similarly, I think it's very important for Australia's future for us to engage much more closely with South Korea, with Indonesia, with Vietnam, and to work out common strategies, not in the form of military alliances or rushing around with guns blazing, but strategies to make clear that we are collectively, as well as individually, resistant to over-exuberant demonstrations of power by China or indeed anyone else. So I think in the context of a potential China-India clash, this kind of dynamic that is evolving across the wider Indo-Pacific of a lot of countries sort of making clear that they do want to push back and not just roll over, kowtow, and completely yield to anything that China might demand of them. That's a very useful message to send in avoiding coming to the kind of conflict that we all fear, whether it's India-China or China-US or anybody else.
On the note of military alliances, you were mentioning earlier about how the US isn't as influential as it once was. Do you think the ANZUS alliance still serves the same purpose it does today as it did originally? Is it time to become more self-reliant? Or should we look to partner up with another major power and create a new alliance in that sense?
No, I mean, the US alliance is what it is, and it's been very useful to Australia, continues to be very useful. Obviously in terms of intelligence sharing, obviously in terms of logistic access, support, and obviously also, I guess, in terms of such deterrent utility as there is in having a power with the muscle that the United States still unquestionably has, at least notionally being in your corner in the event that we should be caught up in some security crisis. I'm a bit of a skeptic about the extent to which the US would ever come to our aid if it didn't also perceive its own interest to be at stake. The notion that the ANZUS Treaty is some open-ended guarantee that if we get into any dust-up with anyone that causes us stress, the US will be there for us. I think that's just a misreading, and always has been a misreading of the treaty. Similarly, reliance on the US nuclear umbrella is something very problematic for us, and something which I'd be very happy for us to be able to sort of gradually ease away from in the period ahead. But none of this means that we should be out there looking for new military alliance partners. I think we should recognise the need to be more self-reliant in terms of the resources we devote to our own military capability, and we should, of course, be working flat out to build relationships not only with like-minded countries around the region who we might need to work together with if the worst did happen, but also, of course, be working flat out on diplomacy to defuse those situations which, might, if they're not properly attended to, disintegrate and deteriorate into potentially violent conflict situations. So diplomacy will always be number one for me in terms of my belief in how to respond to potential threats. But military self-sufficiency to the maximum extent, very difficult for a continent our size to fully defend itself against a really existential threat. But we should be doing perhaps a bit better than we are in terms of that preparedness. And of course, you always prepare on the basis of other people's capability, not their current or known intent. And you've got to be unsentimental about that. But in that context, also having the alliance there is something that offers a degree of reassurance. It should never offer us total reassurance. And it's something that I for one, would certainly not want to, to walk away from completely, even though you've already heard me say it. I do think it's incredibly important for our own credibility that we demonstrate the maximum possible independence from the United States and not be seen as some kind of satrap, some kind of acolyte, always there doing the Americans' bidding, because that's caused us some tears in the past, and it may well do again in the future unless we're very, very careful about how we handle that relationship.
Sure. And obviously one big factor of the US-Australia alliance is the nuclear umbrella. And on the topic of nuclear weapons, how close are we today to achieving a nuclear weapons-free world?
We're probably about as far away from it as we've ever been, and that's evident in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, doomsday clock, which has us, 3 minutes, I think, to midnight at the moment, maybe even it's 2 minutes, which demonstrates that the possibility of a nuclear conflict is still very real. I repeat what I said a moment ago, that I don't think any country is going to unilaterally launch a nuclear attack, an aggressive attack on another. I think the risks of doing so are just incredibly, impossibly high. But there is an absolutely huge risk, and I think still underappreciated, of stumbling into a nuclear conflict through accident, miscalculation, system error, sheer human idiocy. We know from the incidents that have now come to light during the history of the Cold War, just how close we were on multiple occasions to a major nuclear confrontation occurring between the Soviet Union and the United States as a result of human error, system error. And of course, these days, with many more players, 9 countries in total now nuclear armed, many of them with less sophisticated command and control systems. And of course, with a new phenomenon of cyber sabotage, cyber attack, and the potential for misinformation, miscommunication, even greater potential for error than there was in the past. The prospect of a catastrophic nuclear exchange is very real. So I just don't think we can afford to be complacent at all about where we are at the moment, with arms control agreements very fragile, dying or nearly dead or on life support, as between the United States and Russia, with an absolute absence of any movement at all by the nuclear armed states towards serious disarmament, and with even the non-proliferation treaty being probably more fragile than it's been for a long time, as more and more countries get fed up with the unwillingness or inability of the nuclear armed, the weapon states themselves, to show any commitment to disarmament. So I think what we've got to do is focus very, very hard on nuclear risk reduction. Just to talk about going to a nuclear-free world, global zero elimination, and sort of hope that it will happen is chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. The nuclear ban treaty, I love it normatively. I love the message that it sends, with 120 or so countries negotiating a treaty to ban weapons, but with none of the nuclear armed states signing up to it or likely to in the indefinitely foreseeable future. And with all those countries that depend one way or another on the United States for their military protection being either persuaded or bludgeoned into not signing it either, it's really not going anywhere in terms of producing operational results. It's an aspirational rather than operational treaty. But that doesn't mean we should ever abandon that aspiration. And it does mean that we should be working very hard on step-by-step moves toward a nuclear weapons-free world. And I talk in that context of in nuclear risk reduction measures of 4 things in particular as being absolutely critical. One is getting the nuclear armed states signed up, all of them, to a no first use position, which China does embrace, and I think genuinely at the moment, but not many of the others, and certainly the United States is the key player in that respect. I do believe that there should be reduced deployments of nuclear weapons, and probably hard to imagine them coming off submarines at sea, but all the rest of them I think should be put away in storage, and reducing the risk accordingly of misuse of those weapons. Similarly, there should be de-alerting of all those silo-based nuclear weapons, the airborne-based ones, so that again you get away from this lunatic use them or lose them mentality, and 8 minutes worth of decision time if some information or misinformation comes in about a nuclear attack from the other side. And of course, there should be decreased numbers. The full and United States and Russia still have between them over 13,000 nuclear weapons. China has maybe about 300. The other nuclear players have about maybe 1,000 between them. But the overall numbers need to come down. Now, it's not a perfect world if you can, or anything remotely like it, if you've still got 2,000 or more nuclear weapons out there. But if you can get those reduced numbers, if you can get agreement on nuclear doctrine, no first use, if you can get agreement on reduced deployments, further extension of the New START agreement and so on, and if you can get agreement on de-alerting, the world will be a hell of a lot safer and saner than it is at the moment. So that's one of the areas why I talk about China as a possible player in a very cooperative way in this respect. China's always been a minimal nuclear deterrent country. It's always been notionally, and I think realistically, committed to no first use. And it's a very much smaller player than the others. So getting China off the modernization, enlargement, extension track back into serious commitment to trying to get collaborative nuclear arms control measures going would be a very important step forward. Australia, I mention all this because Australia has played a key role in identifying the nature of the problem and ways of moving the game forward. It was Australia that initiated, when I was Foreign Minister, the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. It was Australia that, under Kevin Rudd's administration, produced the report of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament, the Australia-Japan collaboration. It's Australia that has been a very visible voice on these issues, and that's and of course it was Australian NGO that won the Nobel Prize, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which was started in Australia. So our voice is up there and out there, and it's a really huge existential issue on which we do need to make some progress. But at the moment, the environment's about as desolate as it's ever been. My hope is that with the Biden administration again, this will be a change of direction. President Obama was very, very strong on his disbelief in the utility of nuclear weapons and his determination to move towards a weapons-free world. I think Joe Biden shares that aspiration. If you can get the United States talking that talk and walking some at least of that walk, it will change the international dynamics quite dramatically, and I think we should hope like hell for that.
Yeah. And we're approaching time now, so I'm just going to ask one to be the last question. So it's been a really rough week for Australian-China relations with the tweet being released. How do you see the future of China-Australia relations and the best way to mend the bilateral relationship?
Well, it's obviously very tough at the moment because Australia has led with its chin in a number of ways, and China has only been too happy to punch back and to make life very difficult for us on the principle, as is often remarked, kill a chicken to scare a monkey, or kill one to scare 100. Australia is obviously very vulnerable, very fragile at the moment, and China's made life very, very difficult for us. And how to react to it is the central question in Australian foreign policy at the moment, and how we respond is something that's being very closely watched too by the rest of the world. My own story on all of this is that we bear not all the blame, but some of the blame for the relationship being as it is. We have to recognise that we have misstepped in a number of ways in the past. We talked earlier on about the COVID inquiry, and there have been other examples of cloth-eared language and overreaction, I think, to some of the challenges that we face. Getting out of the hole really is not going to be easy, and it certainly does not require us to err on the side of complete sycophancy. We shouldn't roll over, we shouldn't accommodate those aspects of China's behaviour, which frankly are intolerable and have generated a quite proper response around from many other countries. I'm talking about the militarization of the South China Sea in defiance of international law of the sea principles, which China notionally agrees to. I'm talking about, obviously, some of the internal behavior, Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, some of the overreach, obviously, in Hong Kong recently, and in the process, the tearing up of the 1997 treaty, which did guarantee, hopefully, for the next through to 2047, that the the one country, two systems principle would prevail. Obviously, there's quite a lot of economic behaviour by China, which is highly problematic in terms of discrimination in favour of its own interests and intellectual property issues and so on. And there's just a number of issues of that kind which clearly require that Australia and other countries do push back, do stand up. But at the same time, we obviously have to get along with China because of the scale of our economic dependence. I mean, the most modest way of putting our reliance on China is that 30% of our exports go there. In fact, the figure has been rather higher in recent times as iron ore prices have taken off. But, the notion that we can diversify away from that degree of economic reliance on China is I think, a complete fantasy, at least in the short to medium and probably even the long term. So how do we get out of it? I think there's 4 or 5 things that we just have to do. One is, observe the principle that when you're in a hole, you stop digging. So you don't add anything more to the litany of complaints, some of them semi-legitimate, some of them far-fetched, that China has against us. I think we need to be very, very careful in that context about how we handle this new legislation that's just passed, which enables the federal government to tear up state agreements or university agreements with China. This is very delicate territory. And I think we've got to be very, very careful about overreaching ourselves by digging more holes, opening up new fronts for complaint. Secondly, I do think we need to be much less strident and over assertive in some of our language and some of our behaviour, which has not been all that flash in the past. Some of the Wolverines, so-called, in the Australian Parliament, calling out the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese Australians for their notional association with it. It's just been sort of over the top. The ASIO and federal police raids against Chinese journalists were over-assertive behaviour. I think some of the investment decisions, the Lion Dairy, excuse me, some of the recent investment prohibitions on Chinese investment in Australia in manifestly non-security sensitive areas like dairy and so on have been very hard to take. So be very, very careful about the language and the behaviour, just overplaying that assertiveness stuff. Yes, we can understand when offensive cartoons like the one came out a few days ago, we do need to react somehow, but do you need to react at a prime ministerial level? Do you need to be making demands which are obviously not going to be met for apologies and withdrawals and so on? We just need to cool it. The third thing we need to do, I think, is to recognise that there's a lot of legitimacy about quite a few of the Chinese positions. I mean, a lot of its chest beating and assertiveness is a function of what you'd expect any country of its now weight in the world to be doing in international organisations and elsewhere. And we shouldn't overreact. We shouldn't react over aggressively to what is, fairly natural forces of history working themselves out. I think there's been fair bit of overreaction to things like the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and certainly on the anti-dumping stuff. I mean, Australia is really quite vulnerable, as a number of objective commentators have been pointing out. We've initiated many more anti-dumping procedures against China than they have against us, and some of them are really quite problematical, and they should be tested. Both sides' overreach should be tested, I think, in the WTO. But the final thing I would mention in this list of how we go about doing things is look for common ground. When you're having trouble with another country in relationships, it's very, very important to not just focus on the things which are divisive, the things that are going to go on being problematic or sensitive, but it is very, very important to focus on things where there is potential for genuine common collaborative ground. And I think some of those existential global public goods issues we talked about before are in that category. Climate, if we can get our own domestic act together, obviously. Pandemic controls in the future. I mean, China's actual international record is pretty good, Ebola in West Africa and so on. There can be effective collaboration. There can be effective collaboration, I've already mentioned, on the nuclear arms control front, and on piracy, and on terrorism, and on women trafficking and international crime, and a whole bunch of other issues of that kind. So there's one other item in the list that I omitted to mention, and that is the absolute necessity to demonstrate our independence whenever we are making any of these points, whenever we're seeking arrangements cooperatively with China, or whether we're calling China out on some of the things that we're unhappy about. Absolutely critical for us to be seen to be doing this as a result of our own motion, our own decision making, not because someone is across the Pacific is urging us to do this. So I think if you can get that combination of things going, none of this is going to be quick, none of it's going to be easy. A lot of it is going to depend on the general atmospherics in the China versus West relationship, which work themselves out over the next few months. And here again, how the Biden administration handles itself is going to be quite critical. There's quite a lot of tough-mindedness on a bipartisan basis in the United States, and evident among some of Biden's appointees. Biden himself, his language has been quite strong during the primary campaign. But the instincts of this administration will be much less confrontational than that of the Trump administration. And I think if the heat can go out of the trade war, the heat can go out of some of the assertions of Chinese misbehavior, while still maintaining a principled position on tough human rights issues and so on. If that line can be walked a little bit more carefully by the United States, then I think we'll be the beneficiary of that. There's all sorts of ways. I mean, China, I've constantly said, and others have too, China needs us at the moment for the indefinite future for iron ore. Needs us on a massive scale. So China doesn't want an irreparable breach in our relationship, but it can certainly make life difficult for us because it has nothing like the same need for our coal, for our food, for our wine, for student and tourist destination role. So it can make life difficult for us. What we've got to do is recognise that there are interests on both sides, recognise that we have to walk this line between both standing up to China's behaviour that is not acceptable or defensible, but at the same time getting along with China simply because we have to. And I often quote in this context that immortal line from the British or Scottish Labour Party leader Jimmy Maxton in the 1930s, who said, talking about the need for pragmatism, the need for a little bit of compromise in the business of politics, he said, if you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the bloody circus. So I think that's a message for Australian policymakers. We have to ride the horse of pushing back where there's overreach, but we also have to ride that horse of getting along with a country that's absolutely critical to our future as it is to the future of the wider world.
It's a very good note to end on, and that's it for time. But Gareth, it's been a great honor to have you on the show, especially on the first episode. We've learned some very good points on the way forward for Australian foreign policy. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and thoughts. It's been a pleasure to host you.